welcome everyone to Anza's webinar on non-price factors to consider when reducing risk in module selection. So quick housekeeping, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat. We'll maybe take questions in real time, otherwise we'll handle it at the end. And we will be sending out a recording afterwards. So let's meet the panelists. I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Aaron Hall, president of Anza. I have been president of Borrego for the last 22 years. One of my consistent roles has been in procurement of solar modules and other components. And I'm very happy to be here to share insights with all of you.
All right, I'll go next. My name is Anza. I work for Enhanced Capital. We are an impact investment firm. It's been around for about 20 years. The firm has been doing tax equity on solar since 2015. We've deployed over 500 megawatts. In addition to tax equity, we also have a lending platform providing capital to a variety of technologies. And now with the IRA, we're doing kind of like bridge loans and tax credit purchases. So lots of exciting stuff there. Right now I'm director in the climate finance division. I've been at Enhanced for about 6 months, but I really established my career at US Bank in the renewable energy tax equity division there. I was there for over a decade. I ran their technology bankability program as well as their IE engagement programs. So I'm familiar with module and technology reviews from kind of like a big bank perspective on large utility scale deals, as well as some varied individual investors in smaller parts of the market. I'm really excited to talk with everyone today, so thanks so much for having me.
Hey, Tristan Irian Larico from PV Evolution Labs. I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing. I've been with the company for 5 years as of this week, which I think is a record for me for length of employment. I've been in the industry for about 12 years and did manufacturing, did like procurement side of things, and now I'm kind of right in the middle where PVEL positions ourselves. So I'm excited to be here. I'll have more to say about PVEL shortly, but looking forward to it, and thanks for attending.
And I'm Scott Meredith. I'm a product owner for Anza's Engine. I am developing the performance model, which we are trying to get to match PV-Syst in terms of output. In the past, I've also evaluated module data for the purposes of evaluating and establishing PAN files.
Great. And I'm Trevor Dawson, solutions architect here at Anza, focused on BOS costs and racking compatibility. And prior to Anza, I spent the last 7 years at Borrego EPC, focused mostly on racking design optimization and estimating.
Right. Yeah, as you heard, I failed to mention, if anyone's not familiar with Borrego's history, which Scott, Trevor, and I come from, we have been a leader in EPC development and O&M in DG, and then we entered utility scale a few years ago. So that's kind of where we come from. The contents of today's webinar, I'm going to speak to trade and supply chain issues and contract terms. Lon is going to talk about the criteria tax equity providers look for to underwrite a module. Tristan will speak to the data and testing that supports module product bankability. Scott will speak to PAN file analysis. Trevor will cover racking and module compatibility, and then we'll wrap up with some takeaways and onto the Q&A. So starting with trade and supply chain, one of the buzzwords that we're all probably familiar with on the call is UFLPA. UFLPA stands for Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It was signed into law last year. It prevents us from importing any components, modules with any products like polysilicon from the Xinjiang region of China. And so these are some of the things you might consider asking or diligencing when procuring modules to understand the risk profile associated with this topic. So the first one is the source of polysilicon. The reason why I mention that is because to date, as far as my knowledge is concerned, only non-Chinese polysilicon sourced modules have been released from UFLPA detentions. We all, I think, hope and expect that Chinese polysilicon sourced modules will as well. It just hasn't been proven yet, and so the lowest risk profile would be a supplier using 100% non-Chinese polysilicon. Now, there are some suppliers that will provide non-Chinese polysilicon on a PO basis, and I would say that's better than nothing. But they do still have the challenge of kind of proving to customs that they were not commingling and that they have the ability to segregate that polysilicon in their factory based on orders and markets and whatnot. Now, I'll say there are not a ton of module suppliers that have 100% non-Chinese polysilicon source. There's a limited amount of that, and it comes at a premium. But all else being equal, it is a positive from a risk profile perspective. Next topic there I'd like to cover under UFLPA is about traceability audits. It's a good question to ask the supplier if they've performed one or had one performed by a third party, ideally. And if that report's available. Typically, you have to purchase that report from whichever auditor did the report, but it is a good thing to have in your hand, or just knowing that they've done it, frankly, is a good fact pattern. If they have not done a traceability audit, then hopefully the supplier will agree to be subject to one from a third party and agree to liability associated with unsatisfactory results. Lastly, if someone has been detained by UFLPA and they have been released successfully, that's a very good fact pattern. They've obviously cracked the code and can do it. It doesn't mean that all their supply chain will be released. Like I said, the ones that have been released have not necessarily had releases with Chinese polysilicon, but it is a good fact. And so far, very few companies have been detained by UFLPA. Investigations. Also worth noting that WRO, the withhold release order, that predated UFLPA, and someone may have history there, but not with UFLPA, and it's not the same because the bar was raised in terms of having to prove the provenance of materials when we went to UFLPA. Next is AD/CVD, anti-dumping and countervailing duties. The Department of Commerce issued a preliminary determination in the Oxen case back in December, and it was regarding solar cells and modules from Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. The final determination is coming out in May. There were a few companies, 4 to be specific, that were considered non-circumventing. One of those companies is Nui Solar, and that company is actually back into the circumventing category, so there's only 3. They weren't able to accommodate an on-site audit from the Department of Commerce. So it's important to have a plan, for the suppliers to have a plan, and for you to be confident in that plan to be excluded from the AD/CVD tariffs. Right now, basically everyone has a free get out of jail free card, if you will, until June of 2024, when the presidential proclamation expires. But the relationship, by the way, between UFLPA and AD/CVD is you want anyone using one of the exclusions available to them to not have tariffs come June 2024. You want that to be in place beforehand, especially if you're getting any deliveries in Q4 of this year or Q1 or Q2 of next year, because if they don't have that in place, it's possible to get detained by a UFLPA investigation. And then by the time it's released, if they don't have that exclusion, then they're now subject to that tariff. So the 2 exclusions are if you have wafers outside of China, and if you have 4 of the 6 components listed here outside of China. Once again, ideally that supplier is already executing that plan in their supply chain, or can convince you that they've got it all figured out. Lastly, on supply chain and trade policy, we have another buzzword of the day, which is domestic content. That's important because, of course, everyone would like to get a 10% improvement to their ITC, their tax credit, which was enabled by the Inflation Reduction Act legislation last year. The truth is, we don't know the rules of the game yet in terms of how different module manufacturing is going to be considered to kind of check the box. For example, will a module assembled in the United States without any United States bill of materials count for the first year or two? And will that whole module count towards the numerator for the calculation of 40%? So we don't know that yet. That said, I will point out, by working with a supplier that is shipping from the United States and has a US factory, that introduces other risk mitigants, which I think I'll get to in a minute. Let's see. We also know that you need to use prevailing wages and apprentices, as well as US steel, unless you were grandfathered your project back last January. So in terms of things you can do and put in the contract to address some of these potential risks and other risks, for example, just generally speaking, counterparty risks. I'll start with trade and supply chain. It's a good idea to have a limited amount of time for the supplier to be able to get through a customs detention, because the last thing you want to do is be in limbo for months, or frankly, some of the detentions with UFLPA, or at least WRO, have lasted for over a year. And it's possible that those modules never get through. In fact, many customers have experienced completely canceled POs because the supplier did not have the confidence to make it through that detention. They kind of turned the boats around, if you will, or decided not to continue to ship given the environment until they had more certainty. So ideally, if the modules are detained for some amount of time, that's reasonable to work out with a supplier, maybe 90 days, for example, you are able to terminate your contract and get a full refund of the deposit, kind of move on with your life, if you will. You definitely want all your contracts with any suppliers to have representations that there's no forced labor, child labor, bribery, corruption, not only in their company, but all the way up the supply chain, to the top, which is generally quartz from the mine. You'd like them to agree to third-party traceability audits, and the best thing is to have the same treatment as if they're detained for a long time. In other words, if you aren't happy with the traceability audit results, too many holes, if you will, in their process, and you're not confident they can get through a detention, you'd have the ability to kind of walk away once again and get a refund of your deposit, move on to a more sure option. And then, as we'll hear from Lon, it can be important to have factory audits and QA inspections. And so ideally, you've got that kind of pre-approved, and in a perfect world, you even have an exhibit that they've agreed to that meets high standards. So going into that order that you can do those inspections, and they're to a high standard. Regarding counterparty risk, obviously the lower your deposit is, as well as the lower less money you have to pay before delivery. Those are positives. You have more leverage and less skin in the game if things go wrong. Project level warranty insurance can be a really good thing to help shore up other concerns about a smaller, less proven supplier. So knowing that they kind of qualify for that is a good thing. Financials, ideally they have audited financials. That's going to be asked by most finance parties. And for you to understand what you're getting into with the supplier, and how much they can kind of absorb a shock or a cost increase without having to turn the lights off, if you will, or pass that on to you. Ideally, with smaller or riskier suppliers, you've got some form of credit backstop. That can be in the form of a letter of credit, of course, although I haven't seen that very prevalent in the industry the last couple of years. At least it's become more of a supplier's market, and nobody wants to provide a letter of credit. They don't have to. But parent guarantees are often more widely available, depending on who your counterparty is, and that parent guarantee may provide in and of itself a better credit profile. I mentioned this on the last slide, that even if the US supplier, for example, or if you were using a European supplier, which certainly wouldn't, if a US supplier doesn't qualify for domestic content in terms of the 10% ITC boost, there is the advantages of having US assets behind that supplier. Why? Well, if somebody from Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, China, Turkey, if they come into a hard, time with things, costs get out from under them, etc., they are going to often, have pass that down to you, and you may have no legal recourse to do anything about it. Whereas if they have assets here, you can use the legal system here, and they're going to think twice about that breach of contract in the first place. And of course, understanding the supplier's history of retrading in the first place, meaning changing the price after agreed upon and contracted, is helpful to understand what you're stepping into and what kind of counterparty you're working with. I'm going to pass it on to Lon.
All right. Okay, so talking about what the tax equity or your investor is going to do when they're looking at your modules, we have a quick list here of a lot of the criteria or the buckets in which you kind of go through and think about the product. I think these are actually listed in maybe like the most important or most frequently used to kind of less frequently. But of course, the first thing they're going to look at is the deployment and track record of the product within the United States, right? How much of it has been deployed? How has it performed? A lot of those counterparty risks that Aaron touched on the prior slide come into play, right? Like how strong is the company behind the products? How well can you rely on those warranties? I think, maybe there's an element here too, where kind of like there's a tiering list that's out there comes into play, and you can kind of see how much other investors have really deployed on the product, which is helpful. One key piece here, I think, too, is that I think it matters a lot whether or not they've been deployed in the United States. Understanding the level of service that you're going to get for the product, how they meet their warranties, what kinds of staff they actually have in the United States to support the product, and their ability to kind of troubleshoot through issues as they arise. So of course, a lot of times we look at third-party bankability reports. I mean, these are really great for understanding the product, how it works, how it compares to other products, can it be swapped out, how the underlying technology really works. I think of these reports kind of in two buckets, right? There's one where you have a prepared bankability study. The developer comes and they say, okay, we want to use XYZ modules, and here's the bankability report from this really great IE. I think these are great. They're very informative. I think most people do know that there's going to be some selectiveness in what gets included in the bankability report and what doesn't. That doesn't mean they're not worthwhile. And I think you can glean a lot of information. You can get a lot of comfort around a particular product. But I think there is that piece. And if you're, the more savvy your investor, the more likely they're going to pick up on the pieces that are missing. And the other bucket in these bankability reports are when the investor will engage to do a bankability report themselves. When I worked at US Bank, we had a set scope for the IE that would look at these module providers. And I think through the diligence that they do and the reports that they provide, and whatever the result is from their work, you can get really comfortable with a technology, even if it's kind of new. And I think there are a lot of situations where it's really helpful, when you're a large player, a large investor, where you can kind of get ahead of the curve with these bankability reports. Like I remember maybe 5-6 years ago when there are like all of these companies popping up in Turkey. They wanted to avoid the tariff, and you saw a lot of new players emerge, and so it was beneficial for us at the time to kind of look at their capacity in these other countries, knowing that they would start to come and the asks would start to come, and so that we would get ahead of the curve if you will, and do the bankability studies first, so that then when the request came in, we were prepared to be able to either allay particular risks that we did identified in some of these other ways that I'm going to talk about, or we're just ready to deploy the product. I think the challenge with the bankability reports from an investor side, when you're doing the engagement yourself, is, it takes a lot of time. I think these reports take a couple months to put together, and that's assuming that you can get all the information you're looking for. And that was always a challenge with manufacturers. They were not always particularly forthcoming in providing data. They maybe didn't think it was that important to provide some random bank information in order to deploy their product. And I get that, a lot of it's proprietary, and so there were often like gaps in our bankability reports that again, we would then use to, in these other kinds of diligence, we would deploy in order to manage some of the risks that we couldn't quantify. Like a factory audit. This is the third thing on the list here. I think this is really useful, especially when it's because it's managing your QA QC process. You're ensuring you're getting a strong product that's delivered to you. You got to get your kind of testing percentages, thresholds, or pass fail thresholds, I think, in a good place. And you can do it at the start of discussions with an investor. I think this is often a pretty affordable route that people can go, and it moves at the speed of the project, right? Like it happens when you put in your purchase order, they can already be on site. You already know, you're already kind of like, it's just moving with your underwriting process, unlike a bankability, which again can take much longer. And I think these factory audits are particularly helpful for kind of really standard module technologies. Then we have in-field testing. Similarly, I think this kind of falls into two buckets when I think about it, right? There's in-field testing, which is pretty much all of your own experience, your own data. And I think you glean so much information from your own portfolio, the performance of the assets that you have under management, and you can watch them perform over a lengthy period of time. You get a really good understanding of how well the technology works and how responsive and how responsive really the manufacturer is and the quality of the warranty protection. You're going to know pretty quickly when there's a problem. I can think of a couple examples where we had a problem and it showed up on multiple funds, different developers, and so from that experience, like, okay, we have to pull back on this. Maybe it was a particular series or a particular area that we just had to kind of mitigate based on that in-field performance. I think the other bucket is really like test sites, which are really helpful, but I don't know that are always provided readily. Similarly, I think to kind of proprietary information, how your product performs, module providers, manufacturers aren't always as willing to share this kind of data. Because I think there's always the concern, well, it's just a test site, we don't really know, we had to troubleshoot, we had to fix these problems. And I think it's a lot easier if they just are kind of upfront about what happened and then how they addressed it and dealt with it. And I think that can give your investor a lot more comfort if you have actual data and you can talk through it, than just no data. But I will say in-field testing in particular, right, like this requires a lot of time to gather enough data, and it isn't always helpful when you're like trying to get your deal done in a timely manner. Next is project level warranty insurance. I mean, so this is sort of, catch-all for just issues, and can be really useful when you just don't know that much about the product, or you have a weaker manufacturer, financially weaker, you're not concerned about their longevity, their ability to service on their warranties, or maybe even projects that you just don't have enough time to do the diligence, and you're just like, I'm just going to use this kind of catch-all to protect myself in this particular deal. The last one here is lab certification and testing. I mean, I see this most typically deployed with kind of like brand new manufacturers or unique technologies like SIGs or cadmium thin film back in the day. I've even seen it used to kind of support the boost on your bifacial. You know, you want your 20% boost on your bifacial. Somebody's probably going to ask for some backup there. But I think if you're in a situation where you're relying on lab certification, particularly for kind of maybe unique one-off technologies, like you are not going to be doing a large project on that. You're gonna try it out on smaller projects. I would say generally the less sure an investor is, the less likely they're going to go deep or go big on a particular manufacturer. And so for most of this criteria, kind of it's dependent on where the diligence leads you. I think sometimes you can manage the risk through other ways, maybe not through diligence, but also like you could put one small project in with a whole bunch of others so that your cash flows are sort of spent around with systems that you know you're confident in their performance. Trying to think, I had a couple questions that I was going to go through, so I was asked to talk about here.
Lon, just for the time, let's see if we come back to those.
Okay, sure. No worries. Well,
Thank you.
that's the slide. Thanks, guys.
Hey, thanks, Lon. That was great. And Aaron too. So yeah, we've obviously seen some significant considerations for module purchasing there. My slides kind of build off those, but also focus on how what Lon touched upon at the end, certification testing of modules is not sufficient to protect investments. So I'll do some introductory couple slides and then show you some data because PVEL is known for our data. For those of you who don't know us, PV Evolution Labs, or PVEL, as most people refer to us, is the independent lab of the downstream solar and storage market based in California. You may have heard of us from our rather popular PV module reliability scorecard. We had over 30,000 downloads or views of that, I should say, since it was released last May, and the next one's coming up in a couple months. As it shows on the screen, our mission since our founding over 10 years ago is to create data that matters for the industry and to spur adoption. We offer a wide range of services focused on that mission, and we work with companies all over the world, including banks, developers, asset owners, insurers, et cetera, that use our data to help de-risk their projects and procurements. And as it states just on the bottom there, in 2021, PVEL became part of the Kiwa Group, and last year, PI Berlin also became part of the Kiwa Group, and amongst all of us, we offer a full range of due diligence services to module purchasers, including testing, those factory audits that were previously mentioned, in-factory production oversight, field testing, etc. Now, on to PVEL's product qualification program. We launched it in 2012 with two goals. One, as you can see, was to provide the necessary due diligence data to people like Lon and others on the downstream so that, you know, those in attendance here can make imperial data-backed purchasing decisions. And the second focus was to provide third-party recognition to module manufacturers who are producing reliable products. So as it says, we've tested over 500 different bill of material combinations from over 50 different manufacturers. That's by far the largest data set in the industry for extended reliability and performance test results. And our PQP test reports are also a significant component in the third-party bankability reports that Lon mentioned. Bankability reports cover a number of things. One of those aspects is extended reliability testing, and PVEL reports feed into that section of a lot of bankability reports. So a key principle of the PQP is it's regularly updated to provide module buyers with consistently relevant data as new technologies and manufacturing techniques are introduced, similar to what Lon mentioned about new module technologies coming on and the risks for those. The current test plan is shown on screen here. There's a number of tests to address a range of known failure modes in PV modules. We also do some in-depth characterizations with our pan file and IAM profile measurements. We'll hear more about pan files in the next presentation. And so PQP participants submit those factory witnessed samples to PVAL for all the tests shown, and we release reports throughout the project's duration. The reports are available for free if you're a PVAL downstream partner, and they're used by financial institutions, as I mentioned, and their independent engineers to approve the module selection on projects that they finance. So if you want to be a downstream partner, please contact us at pval.com. Okay, my next few slides are going to be 4 examples where the baseline certification testing was insufficient to identify long-term product weaknesses, and shows why you can't rely on certification testing alone. And one thing to note, though, is that certification only sets like the minimum bar in the industry, and it's intended to only identify early life product failures. It's not designed to answer the question of, should this be installed in an asset that's financed over 25 years or, a 30, 40-year project. That's not what certification testing is for. And PVAL and our PQP is trying to fill in that gap. So this first example is from thermal cycling. Modules are chilled down to -40 degrees Celsius, then heated up to +85, and then brought down again to -40. That happens 600 times. As the temperature increases, the modules are subjected to maximum power current, which stresses the soldering and the bypass diodes. So in this case, on the left, we have a module that did really well following the 200 cycles, which is the IEC 61215 certification test duration. But on the second round of 200 cycles during the PQP, the module suffered a catastrophic failure due to short-circuited bypass diodes or potentially an internal open circuit in the module. Hard to know which, but what we do know is the module power dropped by 1/3. Sometimes this is referred to as a submodule failure, and they can be quite prevalent in batches of modules, and something that certification testing rarely will detect. On this next example here, this is from our damp heat test. It subjects the modules to 2,000 hours at high temperature and high humidity that instigates corrosion or delamination for susceptible modules. The IEC certification requirement's 1,000 hours, which is on the left. PQP doubles that duration to 2,000 hours, and that's on the right. Again, we see the module did quite well after 1,000 hours, easily passing the IEC criteria of less than 5% power loss. But after putting that module back in the chamber, we see there's a corrosion issue that's revealed around the cell's perimeter. That's all that dark area that would not be generating electrons, not leading to power. So therefore, there's a power loss. And that 12.8 power loss is higher than 95% of the modules we subject to this test. So probably a module you want to avoid that you wouldn't know you wanted to avoid it from certification testing. Okay, 2 more examples. The second last one is from our mechanical stress sequence that combines, as it shows in the flowchart, static mechanical load, dynamic mechanical load, thermal cycling, again, and humidity freeze testing. So that articulates the module, and it will create and then propagate cell cracks in modules that are susceptible to such cell cracking. And you can see those cracks in the EL images. So on the left, the module did quite well. From a IEC perspective, it would have passed the IEC test. There's less than 5% power loss. And as part of the IEC test, there's no requirement to take EL images. So you wouldn't even know that that underlying damage exists. On the right, we put it through the full test plan. The degradation is more than 5%. And this looks like kind of a Jackson Pollock work of art rather than a functioning PV module that you want in your project. So another one to be avoided. And for this last example, we'll turn to potential induced degradation, which is another fairly common failure mode that can happen to modules. It uses high temperature, high humidity, and high voltage to instigate PID. On the left, the module just squeaked past that less than 5% power loss after 96 hours of PID. So that module would have been certified and could end up in your project. On the right, we show that this has a PID issue. that's further shown in our PQP testing. And again, probably a module that should be avoided because most modules that we test have less than that, the power loss level shown in this example. And final slide for me, just a shameless plug again for our PV module reliability scorecard. You can learn more about the topics I've discussed at modulescorecard.pvel.com, and keep an eye out. As I mentioned, the 9th edition of the scorecard is coming in actually exactly 2 months from today on May 23rd, 2023. So we're hard at work on that and hope you'll check it out. Thanks, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Now I'm going to talk about PAN files. So PAN files are ubiquitous in the PV industry. They're used by PVSys simulations. They're absolutely 100% required by PVSys. Other simulations also use them, like Helioscope, for example. But not all PAN files are created equal. Some are more trustworthy than others. So it's really, really important that you make sure that you have a PAN file that you know is going to be accepted by an independent engineer. For Anza, what we do is we do PAN file vetting based on whether the PAN file was generated by manufacturer or whether it was generated by the third party. For manufacturer generated PAN files, what we'll do is we'll make sure that the PAN file parameters, for example, the electrical characteristics, temperature coefficients, match all the datasheet specifications, because it would be very, very bad to be using a PAN file that doesn't match the product that you're procuring. The other thing that we'll do is we'll do a performance comparison to other modules in our system for certain benchmark projects to make sure that the performance is neither too aggressive nor too conservative. For third-party PAN files, what we do is we look first at the report to make sure that it conforms to our test standards, which are based on the IEC test standards, which includes things like testing a specific number of modules at a specific number of data points. So we'll look at the third-party reports. We'll also look at the PAN files themselves to make sure that the simulated data from the PAN file matches the test data. To the right, you can see a graph showing the simulated data, the solid lines there, plotted against the individual test points, which are the individual markers there. Ideally, what you should see is that the curves pass through the points, pretty much right through the middle of those points. If you see something that's significantly different, that is a major red flag and a probable reason to reject a PAN file based on poor fit. The other parts of a PAN file, major parts of a PAN file affecting performance include things like light-induced degradation, or LID, and incidence angle modifier, or IAM. Light-induced degradation is essentially degradation from a few weeks of exposure to the sun. And incidence angle modifier is essentially the amount of light that gets reflected off the module as opposed to being absorbed by it. We will evaluate those reports again according to IEC standards and our own test standards. And any report that's not rejected, we're going to use an assumed value in place of the value suggested by those reports. Next slide. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So manufacturer versus third-party PAN files. I think, as I mentioned, not all PAN files are created equal. Manufacturer PAN file, it poses an inherent more risk than a third-party PAN file, simply due to the fact that it doesn't have any third-party data to back it up. Manufacturers, when they create their own PAN files, they generate it to their own test data, and they're not prone to releasing their own internal test data. Performance, we can see a change in performance going from a manufacturer PAN file to a third-party PAN file. On the right, what you see is the performance change for 5 selected modules, moving from a manufacturer PAN file to a third-party PAN file for a specific project. This is the performance change associated with temperature and irradiance performance for this particular project. And in this case, you can see one particular module actually had over 1% performance gain in terms of temperature and irradiance just by moving from the manufacturer pan file to the third-party pan file. So there's potential for increased performance just by moving from manufacturer to third party. And that's it for me. Next is Trevor, who's going to talk about racking.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, Trevor here. And the last non-price factor we're talking about today is racking compatibility. So the risk to buyers and owners if you don't prioritize this issue is one of cost and schedule impacts during the design build process, as well as increased warranty on the risk of your warranty risk on your modules. There's a few different ways to think about racking compatibility. The one I want to focus on today is the literal attachment to the racking. And the issue is compliance with the module vendor's installation manual. This is what protects the module warranty. So to ensure that warranty and stave off unexpected costs, we need to check that your attachment method is rated appropriately. So simply, there are two numbers. The pressure rating that's approved by the module vendor for attachment, it's typically in pascals, and that number must be equal to or higher than the pressure rating requirement for the site. This is often easier to figure out for fixed tilt, as the installation manual usually has common attachment means and methods documented in there. But specific tracker attachments are often not included. And so we need to go get module-specific racking approvals. Sometimes these are called compatibility approval letters. All this is not a novel idea, right? We've been doing this for years, but I'm making the case that the risk is higher today, the cost impacts are higher, and so this compatibility diligence should be done earlier in the process. The reason for this is we're seeing changes that are stressing module limits more and more. And the things affecting these limits include variability in racking products. We're seeing more racking products in the market. We're seeing a trend towards more tracker, which tends to have lower limits than fixed tilt. We're seeing a move into more challenging sites, often with higher loading conditions. And like the picture shows, we're seeing larger and often thinner modules with varying glass and materials. Obviously, the magnitude of the risk here varies on all these factors. If you want to install a 450 watt module that's 40 mils thick in a fixed tilt in Arizona, you probably don't need to worry too much about this risk. But that's not really the majority of projects that we're seeing today. We're seeing more trackers in windier areas along the Gulf of Mexico, the eastern seaboard, high snow country. And most folks are trying to use the 550 watt modules or larger. As an example, I've seen a module that looks just like the others in the 550 watt class, with similar dimensions, cell count, weight, etc. But it was 40% weaker than its peers. This module was going to require up to 3 cents more in clamping costs for a tracker project in New York. And that example is really what we want to help our clients identify and understand the risk so they can make an informed decision. And to do that, they need data. And a lot of this data exists, but it's often scattered and siloed. And so at Anza, we're working with module and racking vendors all the time. And we've gathered up and organized a compatibility database that includes major vendors that our buyers can access quickly. With this, we can help customers understand, like, okay, these 3 modules you're interested in, for the racking you're considering, they have pre-approved pressure ratings of X, Y, and Z. Our buyers can check those pressure ratings against the site requirements, and then we can help them evaluate red flags like, okay, this one's not a risk, or this one could be a 2 cent risk, and we should further discuss that with the module or rack vendor. And also, if the data doesn't exist, the module vendor hasn't yet talked to the top 5 rack vendors in the US, that's also helpful for our buyers to know. In this case, Anza and PVEL can help you coordinate testing required to de-risk the issue. So summarizing, this diligence is required to ensure your module warranty. And given the changes in the solar landscape, it pays to do the work earlier in the process. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to Aaron to take us home.
Thanks, Trevor. So just quickly to get to Q&A, as best as possible. I'll review some of the takeaways here. If you're shopping for modules or procuring modules on price alone, hopefully we've demonstrated it carries a lot of risks. Some of those risks are listed here. Deliveries can be delayed by months or maybe even never fulfilled. Deposits can be lost in the process. Price can increase after a PO is accepted. Financing approval could drag out for a long time or not be achieved. ITC benefits may be left on the table. Production models may get major haircuts from what you expected when you made that decision to choose that module. Racking costs may ultimately increase, or your module warranty may actually not be valid. So just real quick about Anza, hopefully it's understood we can help with these risks and mitigating the risks and understanding these risks. We can help because we have supplier and product due diligence available to our customers already and quickly. We can provide advice on trade policy and makeability, potential concerns or pitfalls that may arise. As Scott told you, we vet PAN files and therefore are confident in the performance characteristics when we perform analyses. And we have a lot of the terms and conditions that help de-risk orders pre-negotiated in our contracts already that our customers can take advantage of. We, of course, also measure financial returns, that we have this engine that ranks the module options by project, net present value, and incorporates both the revenue, performance, production side of things, as well as the CapEx, BOS cost impact side of things. We have a website that you can refer to that talks about some of these things, and you can learn more. We also have other webinars, like our last webinar about buying based on value versus cost. And of course, we invite all attendees who have not done so before to submit your projects on our platform and see for yourself how it works. So I'll invite all the panelists back to get into the Q&A. We have about 12 minutes. I do want to say that if we don't get to some of the questions that were raised today, we probably will be able to answer them via email. So don't worry if your question isn't answered. And then let's just dive in. Let me see, start with you, Tristan. Is batching an issue? Let's see. I think the question was, do you find issues with top tier brands like Qcells and Maxeon the same as with lower tier brands? And obviously you're going to probably comment on those names, but I think maybe you get the hint. And is it possible to answer that question?
It is not possible to name names in the answer of that question, but generally speaking, we've seen that no one gets a free pass. We test a lot of modules from a lot of suppliers, and in a lot of cases, our testing is to confirm what they say. That they say they make the best modules in the world, and here's a PVAL report supporting that. But in a surprising number of cases, we find things that they weren't expecting. And if we were to look at, power degradation or the number of test kind of failures or wet leakage failures and some of these other characterization failures and plotted them by say tier 1 brands versus tier 2, even though I don't love either of those terms. But anyway, if we were to do that, I think you'd see similar ranges by both. We can't say that, all of the big players are making great modules and all of the smaller aren't, or vice versa. There's no correlation between, the module size, not the module size, the manufacturer size or the manufacturer's representation. I think we can see good modules from all of them, and sadly, poor or not so good modules from all of them.
Great to know. I'm not sure I understand this, but maybe you do. Is batching an issue for the top tier brands? Maybe that's the same.
Yeah, I think what that question is getting at is like the batch to batch variability or the manufacturing consistency.
Okay.
With PPP testing, we're really looking at qualifying the design, not qualifying the consistency in production. That's where like our sister company, PI Berlin, goes into the factory, does the factory audits, and also does the production oversight. We do offer batch testing where, you know, a sampling from each batch can be tested, and same sort of thing. Normally that's to confirm that the manufacturing consistency is there, but sometimes it shows the opposite where, you know, there is batch to batch variability. And again, I don't think there's a strong correlation to good results from top players and poor results from the smaller manufacturers. That varies as well.
Thank you. Lon, question from the audience. What sources do you use to find module or OEM deployment and track record in the US, since you mentioned that's one of the first things that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, anything that's publicly available. We'll use the Bloomberg tiering list. We'll go to their websites. I would say that pretty much every tax equity investor is going to have you engage in IE for the closing of your project. That IE will do a review of all of your major equipment, including the modules, and they'll probably have quite a bit of data that they'll provide as well. That's not as available publicly. So I would say those kind of are the big ones.
And let me ask you a follow-up. Let's see. What was I going to ask? Actually, no, we'll move on. What about the?
What do you think of it?
Well, actually, no, I remember now. Let's say you look at that OEM and they have a long track record in the US. All the boxes are checked from that perspective. And I guess not only do they have experience, but I guess no negative, track record is also you're looking for. But they have a new module that doesn't have any experience in the US. How does that factor in?
I mean, I guess it sort of depends on how different it is. Are we just talking about like it's a little bit bigger, or we're like significantly changing the design of the module? I think those two things factor in. I mean, module manufacturers are making adjustments to their modules all the time. They're hopefully constantly improving. I think the best ones usually do. And so you will find a lot of changes in the series and from series to series and even between the different sizes. So I think generally once you're sort of like, these big banko, let's call them the big bankable brands, like they're going to change stuff all the time. And most of the time that's going to just continue to get deployed. I think if they were going to change their technology, like they went from mono poly to like, I don't know, SIGs or some of the other ones that I mentioned.
Well, here, I'll just ask, I mean, we're dealing with TopCon as like new on the scene, right? So you've got a supplier checked all the boxes, but now they've got TopCon and we can present it to you to finance. How do you approach that?
Well, part of it is just figuring out how that technology works, like how different is it, what the different components are that are going into the module that are going to affect it, like how different is it on the line, like how different is the kind of the component manufacturing pieces, like how different is it for them to put all the pieces together, or is it pretty similar? Like I remember when bifacials came on and it was like a big deal, but it was really like, oh, we're just taking the back sheet off. Like it's the same thing, we're just taking the back sheet off. Okay, like I can get there a lot easier with similar manufacturers because they have a better understanding of how it works.
Thank you. While you have Mike,
can I interject?
Yes.
I can't let that go by without.
Uh-oh.
No, I mean it's fine. There's different due diligence levels, by different players in the industry. We have enough data to show that going from a backsheet based module to a glass module, like for example, Trevor was talking about the mechanical loading. The modules break on the tracker when they switch to double glass, and when it's glass backsheet, the module didn't break. And so now you have to change your mounts and do other things to mitigate that. We also have data showing the same manufacturer, their PERC module versus their TopCon module, and the results are completely different. And it's not like that's necessarily a small player that doesn't have a track record. So
all right.
And there are certain investors, I realize, there's a range of risk profiles and due diligence in the industry. And I'm not trying to say, oh, you must do it this way. Those that are extremely risk adverse will require testing on everything. You can't change the flux that's used in soldering of the module without needing to go through PQP testing. And those ones are just like got the highest due diligence level, and others get comfortable with a change like that or a change from PERT to TopCon. So there's a range of due diligence requirements, and we've got data probably that supports being more risk adverse than some others.
Thank you. Lon, also, does the size of the project or portfolio matter if a module is proposed that you haven't financed before? Like, is your due diligence process the same? Does your willingness to accept vary?
Yeah, no, I hopefully, yes, it does matter. I think if you're doing a smaller project, you're obviously taking less risk in terms of your total cash flows, in terms of what you're looking at on the project. Your capital outlay is just smaller. So you often can be, I think people are more willing to take risks with smaller projects, especially just to try them out and see if it works. I mean, there's so much new technology out there, things are going to work, some are not, and like it can't always be in a situation where you're just not going to deploy it. And so you try to find other ways to get there with it. One of the ways is, kind of embedding that project, a smaller project, in larger projects that have more reliable technology. I think that's pretty common.
And just last one for you, the time frame for approval, standard, average, fast and long.
It's going to depend on the product. It's going to depend on how wacky it is or how, commonplace it is, right? You come when big box.
I think I heard like it could be 3 months. Is that a typical kind of time frame for you?
Yeah, I mean, so for some of those bankability reports, that's how long they would take to get all of the data and to kind of check all the boxes and really get comfortable with it. Yes, 3 months.
Thank you. Hey, Scott, what are some factors that influence how well a PAN file fits its associated test data?
So I would say there's two major factors. The first factor is how good of a job the lab did of generating the test data. Coincidentally, I would say pBuild is one of the best jobs out there. Other labs, maybe not so much. The second factor is the method used to generate the PAN file parameters. PVSys provides a very convenient method of doing that. However, it is not the best method and often results in a fit that is very poor. The better method is to actually modify those parameters individually to get a good fit to the test data.
Thank you. Trevor, have you ever seen a module rejected outright by a racking vendor?
Launching the cloud. The short answer on that is no. At least in the last 3 years, I haven't heard of any full stop rejections. At the end of the day, though, racking is a custom design build solution. And when a new module comes onto the scene, you're kind of asking a bunch of engineers to solve a problem. Like, they're going to figure out something. It's really just a question of cost and time. Actually, it can take a long amount of time to figure that out as well. I have seen 3 purlins required on a fixed tilt rack before for a certain module. And I think my example earlier, we ended up with like 3 or 4 cents, seeing 3 or 4 cents in clamp costs on a tracker project.
Thank you. Scott, another one. Assuming the module's BOM doesn't change, why should we expect performance to change going from a manufactured PAN file to a third-party PAN file?
Yes, I think one of the major reasons is due to the flash testing. There's 22 different points that need to be tested in terms of irradiance and temperature combinations. And it's fair to say that the way that a manufacturer is conducting PAN file testing is probably different than the way a third-party lab is conducting testing, even though there are IEC standards. So it's definitely possible that even given the same procedures, that you would end up with a different PAN file.
And this is for Scott and Lon, I think, but I believe that the lab matters, who does for performance modeling, for example. Like if it's a lab you're not familiar with, will you kind of reject that third-party PAN file? Or does it matter in your mind? I guess for maybe both of you from your experience working with IEs or finance parties, for you, Scott, and being one, Lon. Scott, maybe you first.
I would say based on the data I've seen, there are certain labs that I prefer and others that I do not prefer. So yes, from my perspective, that it does matter.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean, if they're completely unheard of, I think it would be flagged and we'd probably find an alternative.
Thank you. All right, I'll just take the last couple quick ones. Someone asked about the criteria grandfather. It's too late, but back in January for the apprenticeship and whatnot, and prevailing wages, that was kind of like the safe harbor play for previous tax credit reductions. You had to order, your equipment. It was the same kind of rules that ITC, step downs have used in the past. For example, buying 5% of your product and having it received in a few months. Also, let's see real quick. We are going to probably find out about guidance in May, both from a AD/CVD final determination perspective, as well as the domestic content kind of guidelines from IRS. So I think that may be all the time we have to cover today for questions, but once again, we'll try to amass the questions and get them out to registrants either with or separately from the recording that we're going to send out. But thank you to all of the panelists for your time in preparing and attending today's, I called it before, Anzanar. And everyone have a great day. Thank you.